Tony, before the show starts, I think you need to tell folks we're on social media.
I do. We're on social media.
Well, there you go. We're now on Facebook and Instagram, and it's at Going Hollywood Pod on both of those.
So that's our handle, at Going Hollywood Pod, on both Facebook and Instagram.
And what are we posting, Tony?
And we're going to just be posting, we'll talk about the show occasionally, but mostly it's just going to be like, what's happening? Who's a birthday? Who do we want to talk about and commemorate today? Who died? Because that happens a lot. It'll be fun.
So it's at Going Hollywood Pod, and it's Facebook and Instagram. Links are in the show notes or on the website, goinghollywoodpodcast.com. You'll find them there too.
Go on, stay tuned.
Look at her, Shelley. Can you believe that bland and lovely brow conceived of Frankenstein? A monster created from cadavers out of rifled graves?
It's alive! The monster! It's alive! Ooh.
This heart is useless. I must have another. And it must be sound and young.
Sometimes I have wondered whether life wouldn't be much more amusing if we were all devils. And no nonsense about angels and being good.
It is bad to be alone. Alone. Bad. Friend. Good. Friends. Good. She's alive. Alive! To a new world of gods and monsters.
Hello, I'm film historian Tony Maeda.
And I'm Brad Shreve, who's just a guy who likes movies.
We discuss movies and television from Hollywood's golden age. We go behind the scenes and share our opinions, too.
And of course, being the average guy, my opinions are the ones that matter.
As does your self-delusion. Welcome to Going Hollywood.
Tony, I want to read to you an email from a listener of ours. Are you trying to clear your throat? Oh, good God. You don't have much energy. Are you going to be like this the whole time? Well, listener, if that wasn't a hint, here's an additional hint. We got this letter from a listener named Susan. And in addition to praising our podcast, which is no surprise, she said, maybe you might consider a show about Bride of Frankenstein. Thanks in advance. I will keep listening. And Susan, I'm sorry it's taken so long, but when we got your message, I said, Tony, let's save it for Halloween month in October. And I did want to tell you that because what if we didn't get around to doing it? So here it is. Thank you for letting us know. Other listeners out there, follow Susan's lead and let us know what you think we should do.
Let us know.
Are you ready for this, Tony?
Good. Email, good. Text, good.
You watched...
Yes, I am. I'm not going to do that through the whole podcast.
Thank God.
Is it better than my Brando, though?
Well, yeah, it's much better than your Brando.
Good.
Years ago, I can't remember what it was. There was an acting game show where they had to act out scenes, and then there were stars, and then there were aspiring actors. And then the aspiring actors were graded, and then one would get the prize at the end. And one of them was given this very... I wish I could remember what the movie was. But it was a very dialogue-filled film. And the other guy was given Frankenstein. I'm like, that is... How do you do that?
You go...
So naturally, he lost.
You go, that's not true. You go, smoke, good.
if they were in Bride of Frankenstein.
Oh, that's true. That's true, because he doesn't talk in Frankenstein.
No.
Yes. Okay.
No, and Karloff was not happy about...
No, he was not. But anyway... Let's get into this, but first I want to say, it's a perfect night for mystery and horror. The air itself is filled with monsters, Brad. So let's get on with Bride of Frankenstein from 1935, Universal, starring Karloff. No first name, just Karloff. Boris Karloff.
I'm curious because I don't remember that exact line. I know it was at the beginning. Were you doing... the quote from Mary Shelley or her effeminate husband or her effeminate friend, Lord Byron?
How about you really can't tell, right?
No.
Jeez, what a trio. I'm like, holy cow, Byron. Hey, girl.
Two friends, and I'm sorry, some people will be offended, but two friends and their hag.
That's true. No, that's truly, that was Mary Shelley. That was Elsa Lanchester as Mary Shelley, and also as the bride, question mark?
The bride.
As the bride.
The bride.
So yes, I want to ask you something.
Yes.
About this film. Do you think it's the greatest horror film ever made?
I don't know if it's the greatest. I'd have to think about that. I think The Thing, not the 1950s version, but the newer version with Kurt Russell, was terrifying. This movie is probably the most fun.
Yeah.
That's what I think.
I'm not a horror whore. I'm not a horror.
You're just a horror.
I'm just a horror. I'm not a horror. I'm just a horror. I'm not a big horror fan.
Yeah.
I never have been. I probably never will be. I do like classic horror, though. And to me, this is probably, because to me, it's so much more than a quote, horror, air quotes, horror film. I think it's so many layers. It's so much later than I hope we get into it. But I also wanted to ask you another question.
Okay.
And that is, we recently talked about a film, Tootsie. And how is The Bride of Frankenstein like Tootsie? And don't say the bride's makeup. Don't say the leading lady's makeup.
No, the bride to me looks like Lily Munster put her finger in a light socket.
Yeah. But how are Tootsie and The Bride of Frankenstein? What's similar about them?
I'm gonna say it's a message about women and gender roles.
Well, not really. I don't know where you're reading that. It has to do with the director. It has to do with the director of both. Obviously, they were two different directors. Tootsie is 1982, and The Bride of Frankenstein is 1935. James Whale, Sidney Pollack. Okay, the thing is that their directors both saw them differently than audiences did. So stay with me. So Sidney Pollack saw Tootsie as a drama. And James Whale saw The Bride of Frankenstein as a comedy. So isn't that interesting? And you know what? I believe that is what gives The Bride of Frankenstein its classic status, its timeless quality, is its humor.
Oh, I agree 100%.
It was funny in 1935 and is just as funny almost 90 years later as she was in 1935.
When this started, and you had that opening scene with Mary Shelley explaining to the two guys that there's an additional story after the Frankenstein story. And that's how they led into the start of the movie. I'm like, where is this? This is like really campy. And where is this going? And then the movie started, I was like, this is going to be terrible. And then it hit me. This is supposed to be good, campy fun. And I had a great time with that.
It's really interesting, the layers of it.
Yeah. If you're expecting a terrifying horror film, it probably was terrifying in its day. I know the Phantom of the Opera, they say women fainted in the theater. So it's a different time, but it's also a lot of fun.
It's a lot of fun. It's very moving. It's very touching. I find the monster incredibly touching, incredibly moving. You know, he is, God, there's so many layers. You know, Universal that made The Bride of Frankenstein, Universal Horror, Universal Horror, that term is kind of a catchphrase now but Universal really started the genre in the silent era. You just mentioned the Phantom of the Opera. That was Universal. Yep. Lon Chaney. The Hunchback of Notre Dame. Again, Lon Chaney, Universal. So Universal had a background in horror films. And when Carl Lemley's son, Carl Lemley ran Universal. When Carl Lemley's son, Carl Lemley Jr., that's not difficult to remember, everybody called him Junior, decided that Universal was just making Westerns. They were big on Westerns when sound happened. And he said, we have to, in order to compete with MGM and Paramount and the big players, we need to find something besides Westerns. And they went right back to horror films. And the first impactful one was Dracula, starring Bela Lugosi. And that started the entire Universal horror cycle. And that's what Universal really became known for in the 30s, was its horror films.
And I can list the monsters that are most well known from that era. We have Dracula, Frankenstein, The Mummy, The Invisible Man, The Bride of Frankenstein, even though she only had 7 minutes, The Wolfman, and Creature from the Black Lagoon. Now, there were a lot of sequels to those, and there were some others that didn't really stand out, but those are the ones I think most people think about.
Oh, absolutely. And they're all Universal Horror. They had their original, their most impactful form, their most impactful presence was in Universal Horror. And, I just want to say a little bit about Carl Lemley Jr. in Universal. I'm not going to go a lot into it, but it's Carl Lemley was a very fascinating man. Carl Lemley was truly a pioneer. I mean, we're going all the way back to when Thomas Edison was controlling films with his patents. I mean, and Carl Lemley, for a short little German immigrant, Carl Lemley had some guts. He is one of the first people to bring the film industry to Hollywood, mostly to escape Edison's patent men, because they were a real bunch of thugs who would shoot up cameras so people couldn't make films. And he formed Universal Studios, which still is around. I mean, it's pretty amazing to me that the studio he founded is still alive. And the amazing thing about Carl Lemley was there's a famous joke back then that they used to say was that, first of all, he was the king of nepotism. He hired relatives all the time for very altruistic reasons later during Hitler in the 30s. But there was a joke going around, and the joke was Carl Lemley has a very large family, because he was constantly hiring relatives, and you had to be nice to the custodian because you didn't know, maybe he was Uncle Carl's nephew, because they were all over the place. And that was his nickname, Uncle Carl. And one of his biggest examples of nepotism was hiring his son, Carl Lemley Jr., as production head at Universal. And Carl Lemley Jr. is, as I said, is the one who is really behind this, going back to the Universal's legacy of horror and really taking it across the finish line to a new level with these films.
Well, should I give a breakdown of the film? It's pretty easy.
Yeah, I think you should. It's pretty easy because they give a recap of you should say, of course, it's a sequel to Frankenstein from 1931. And what I love about The Bride of Frankenstein is that you really don't have to watch Frankenstein, because they give you the bullet points in the beginning of the movie, The Bride of Frankenstein.
I'm glad that's a tradition that didn't continue.
Yeah. Well, that was a little crazy.
So this is the 1935 sequel to the 1931 Frankenstein film, which was a huge hit. Not as big of a hit as Dracula, but it was still a big hit. This is one of 8 movies that featured the Frankenstein's monster, some better than others. Frankenstein was like the first soap opera. He died every movie and then he's back to life the next one. One way or another. I know one time he was found frozen in ice. I think that was by the Wolfman. I don't remember. He just kept coming back.
That's funny.
This is based on the book Frankenstein or the Modern Prometheus. Now, Mary Shelley, who wrote the Frankenstein novel in 1818, she did not write The Bride of Frankenstein, but in the novel, Frankenstein was building a mate for the monster because the monster was asking him to. Mm-hmm. The mate was never brought to life. So this movie brought the mate to life.
Yes. 9 different writers brought her to life.
Yeah.
We said there were a lot of writers on The Wizard of Oz. There were a lot of writers on the Bride of Frankenstein. There really were.
And it is considered by many, I saw it one time after another, the greatest of all time Universal monster movies, as well as one of the greatest sequels of all time. Yeah. I'd have to think about whether I agree on that one. It's probably the funnest.
You don't think it's the Godfather 2 of horror films? I mean, that's its reputation, is it's better than Frankenstein.
It's different than Frankenstein. I went back and watched Frankenstein after this so I could see, because I'm like, this is really different.
Yeah.
It is better in a sense, but it's also hard to compare. Frankenstein is more of a traditional horror film. It's darker. It's slower paced. This one was, in addition to being humorous, was quicker paced.
Right.
And boy, the body count. The body count in the first movie was only 3 people. First 2 were murdered by the monster.
Yes.
The third one was the famous scene of the girl where he threw her into the pond. And he was playing with her, so he didn't mean to drown her.
Right.
So he really only killed outright 2 people. As I understand in this film, originally there were 21 people that were murdered by the monster. And the Hays Code, he reduced it down to 10.
Yeah, exactly. No.
But he was on a rampage.
Joseph Breen's like, you can't have that many murders. You can't have that many murders. Yeah, see, it's important to point out that Frankenstein 1931 was, pre-code.
Yes.
So they could get away with a lot more. By the time The Bride of Frankenstein was made in 1935, the code was very strictly enforced. And Joseph Breen was running the show, and Joseph Breen was kind of a creep. And he had a lot of problems with a lot of the stuff. He had a lot of problems with the script, with the Christian allusions that we can talk about. He had a problem with Elsa Lanchester's cleavage in the prologue. This guy, well, he just had to stick up his ass about it.
And necrophilia, too.
And necrophilia. He didn't like the, yes, he did not. And can you imagine what Dr. Pretorius did to Joseph Breen? His cackles just must have went up, and he was like, "What is this man? Who is this man? What is this man?" Yes, it had some issues with the production code. Absolutely. But go ahead and tell us a brief rundown of this thing.
Okay, it's produced by Carl Lemley Jr., as we said, directed by James Whale. It starred Colin Clive as Dr. Henry Frankenstein, Elsa Lanchester as Mary Shelley, who played, and also the monster's mate.
Right.
Valerie Hobson, who played Elizabeth Frankenstein. Now, she replaced Mary Clark from Frankenstein.
Correct.
And actually, she's Frankenstein's fiance and then wife later in this film.
Yes.
And then Karloff, Boris Karloff, as the monster. And the theme of this movie, at the end of Frankenstein, for those that remember, on Frankenstein and the monster were on the windmill. The monster threw Frankenstein off the windmill. He had a pretty heavy-duty fall. He fell into one of the blades and then fell to the ground. And then the monster was, air quotes, died in the fire. So this movie opens up where the monster is alive in the water. And they take Dr. Frankenstein's body away. So this starts almost like a few minutes after.
Yeah, immediately.
The first film, because... Well, they had enough time for the whole thing to burn down.
It's very funny.
And the saddest thing to me, this is the saddest part of the whole movie. I think the little girl's name was Maria, the daughter she was killed in the first movie, and the first two victims in this film is her father and then her mother. And his father was choked to death and drowned. The mother was gruesome. The monster threw her, and her body just kind of flung down the stairs.
Threw her right in the well.
God,
Goodbye. Isn't that funny? It's almost like one of those Friday the 13th, where the girl who survives, I can't remember what she's ever called, the last surviving girl in all these movies, always gets killed first in the sequel. And you're like, wait a minute, you hung on through all that only to be killed in the sequel. Huh? What's up with that? Yeah, I thought that was a little brutal.
And I'm like, that whole family is now gone. I don't know if they have any other children, but they're gone.
The way I look at it, they were just too torn up by their daughter's death. So they're all together. They're reunited.
Yes, they're all together now. And then, this woman named Minnie, who she reminds me of Dr. Smith on Lost in Space. She's like a flamboyant drag queen.
The sublime Una O'Connor. Oh, amazing. So much fun.
She's equally fun and annoying.
Yes.
And she wasn't in the first movie. How all of a sudden she became this servant to Dr. Frankenstein? I don't know. She came out of the blue.
Well, that was one of the things Whale did. He didn't want to do this. And the only way he said he would do a sequel again, of course, is he hired all his friends. This is a completely British cast and make it a comedy in his mind. So that's why she's in there, because she's a fabulous, funny character actor. She's a lot like Cloris Leachman. She's not quite Frau Blucher from Young Frankenstein. I was like, she's Frau Blucher? But pretty damn close.
I swear, I'm like, am I watching Cloris Leachman?
Yeah. No, you can see that. That's the inspiration. And I do want to say that, as I said earlier, I'm not a big horror fan, but, I really first came to these movies through Mel Brooks. I first came to Hitchcock through High Anxiety, and I first came to the horror films from Young Frankenstein. So I'm, of course, watching The Bride of Frankenstein, thinking about, is Young Frankenstein. Elizabeth, Madeline Kahn, same Kahn. I mean, you kind of see it, you kind of don't. But I do think there was an inspiration there. But go ahead with the plot. I interrupted you.
Yeah, I'm not going to go too much detail because it's pretty simple, and we're going to go into it because I want to talk about that, and then I'm going to tell you my history with this film. So anyway, the mob is chasing after the monster, and there's a Dr. Pretorius who was a professor to Dr. Frankenstein, who is even more obsessed than Dr. Frankenstein is with creating life. He wants to create a brain organically, which he does. And they find a female body, to give the monster a bride. And that's what this movie is about. The bride is only in there for 7 minutes, which was rather disappointing because she is hysterical.
The first time I saw this, I was like, that's it?
Yes.
That's it? She was in there longer than Beatrice Straight was in Network, but still, I'm like, really?
Yeah.
No wonder he cast. Whale said he wanted the same actress to play Mary Shelley as played the bride. So maybe it's because she had so little screen time. But Elsa Lanchester is so iconic from those 7 minutes, and that hairdo, and that hiss. I mean, isn't it amazing? 7 very impactful screen minutes, I'll tell you right now.
Exactly. You asked me about the comparison to Tootsie, and I said women. You know, I read a lot of theses on this film, and one of them, which I didn't agree with, really went in depth about how the Bride of Frankenstein goes deep into feminism, and they had all this stuff. I'm like, where did they get this from a 7-minute scene? So that's why it came to me.
I'm not doing the monster. I'm agreeing with you. It works for both.
Tony, you and I get excited when we get messages and emails and texts from listeners that tell us how much they enjoy the show.
We do.
But, you know, I think we should push it a little bit and ask them to go a little bit further.
Ooh, a challenge.
If you enjoy this show, let others know. 5 stars are great, whatever you want to give, except 1 star. If you have 1 star, say, you know, that show's not for me and move on.
Yeah, you don't need to, don't give us 1 star. Just say, no, not for me. Just skip it. Or tell your friends. That's the best way too, right? Tell your friends, hey, I have this great fun podcast with these 2 kooky guys who talk about movies and TV. We run the gamut. We have everything.
Yeah, we're all over the place.
We're all over the place is a better way to put it.
But in a good way. So do it right now before you forget. I am normally not a fan of getting deep into subtext because so many people pull them out of their ass to fit their agenda.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Anyway, let me tell you about my history with this film. You may know this about some Universal monster movies being released to local TV stations in the 50s, and then they released even more in the 1960s. And the studio suggested to the local stations that they have a host to introduce those films. So 19 cities ran creature features on the weekend. And it was in South Bend, Indiana station where a little boy in southern Michigan named Brad would stay up late with his brothers and watch these old films. And that's how I began my love for monster movies. For some of the greats, and then some of the, I'm not even going to say not so great, some of the horrible ones, like the Mole People, which I loved just as much. Later, my family moved to Pennsylvania, where the Pittsburgh station didn't have creature features. Instead, they had Chiller Theater, which is hosted by Bill Cardell. Any true horror fan knows Cardell from playing himself as a reporter in the original Night of the Living Dead.
Yeah, yeah.
And he was in that film because it was filmed around the Pittsburgh suburbs, and he was a local reporter.
One of my acting teachers was in, well, he was in Day of the Dead. Not Living, but Day of the Dead, Monroeville Mall.
Yes, Monroeville Mall. That mall was so fucking big. It was like our big excursion to go there and go shopping. That damn thing was huge.
It's crazy. It's crazy.
I'm going to wrap up Waxing Nostalgia by saying, for whatever reason, I pulled away from these old films. So I want to thank you again, Susan, for suggesting this movie because you brought back some good memories.
Oh, that's lovely. That's lovely. That a monster movie can bring back lovely memories for you. You know what my big conduit to this was, and I don't think it's going to surprise anybody. I mean, because as I said, I saw them, Young Frankenstein, and then I'm sure I saw 1 or 2 when I was a kid, and then of course I saw Gods and Monsters.
Shock.
And I was shocking. I'm sure everybody's like, I'm shocked. I'm shocked that was Tony's conduit into these movies. But wow. I'm not going to go into Gods and Monsters too much, although I would like to talk about it. But what it also really did was bring James Whale to my attention, who was an extraordinary man, an extraordinary director. If anybody hasn't seen Gods and Monsters starring Ian McKellen and the incredible Brendan Fraser and the wonderful Lynn Redgrave, I urge you to watch it. It's a fun, entertaining film and disturbing film, but wonderful film. And in that film, Ian McKellen plays James Whale. And James Whale was a one-time actor, theater director, who was brought to Universal originally as a dialogue director. And he was a dialogue director on Hell's Angels. Now, a dialogue director happened in the early days of talkies because many of these great directors from the silent era couldn't direct actors to talk. So you needed theater directors. So George Cukor was a dialogue director. James Whale was a dialogue director. A lot of theater directors ended up being film directors because they started out just directing actors in these movies. So he started out as a dialogue director, and he was, of course, you knew where this was going, one of the very few openly gay directors in Hollywood, almost to his detriment. We talked a little bit about this, and I said, George Cukor was very circumspect. He was very much a realist. George Cukor played the game. James Whale did not play the game. James Whale, we kind of admire that now. I admire it tremendously that James Whale was like, no, this is who I am, and if you don't like it, fuck you. But it wasn't that way, particularly in the 30s as things got more conservative and the production code kicked down. But James Whale did some amazing films. The horror films, Frankenstein, The Invisible Man, Bride of Frankenstein being many. And because he was openly gay, many people read gay subtext into this film. And I see some of it, but some of it I don't. Some of it I'm like, no, that's just the horror movie. It doesn't have anything to do with the director is a homosexual. What are your thoughts on that?
Going back to what I said, I do think discussions of subtext is obviously important, but it also makes me nervous. However, I kept reading the same things over and over again. And actually, I got to admit, as I was watching the movie, I was seeing some of it myself. I think some of it does stretch a bit, but it is there, I think. Even if it wasn't meant to be, it was subconsciously. I mean, let's talk about Ernest Thesinger.
Okay.
This is from film journalist Gary Morris. He referred to Thesinger as one of the most outrageous queens of 30s movie queendom.
Yeah. I think that's true.
An example I'm going to give is Stand By Me. Jerry O'Connell was in Stand By Me. He was the fat kid who, when he went to film school, the director was talking about all the subtext in Stand By Me. And nobody knew who he was because he looked much different as a kid in the film. And he raised his hand and he said, "Sir, I was in that film and Stephen King never mentioned any of this," which I thought was brilliant.
That's great. That's great.
I thought it was brilliant.
It's true. It's true. People do this. You know what? They read the otherness of the monster. Yes, otherness. Gay people sometimes feel like the other, but so do monsters. The loneliness of the monster, the fact that he feels rejected by society could be the gay subtext. It could also be because he's a monster and he's terrifying looking. So, you're going to read what you're going to read into it. A lot of contemporaries of James Whale said, no, Jimmy was first and foremost an artist, not a gay artist. And yes, Dr. Pretorius, we can't ignore Dr. Pretorius.
Oh, good Lord.
I know. Well, it was originally slated for Claude Rains, and Claude Rains wasn't gay. I don't know that he would have necessarily brought the camp value that Ernest Thesinger brings to it, but, I think as you said, we read things into this that may or may not be there. And I guess, that's what film does. It's open for your interpretation.
It was an era of the 60s. Lord Byron, who was played by Gavin Gordon, he was a gay man. He was very much a sissy in the film. Percy Shelley, who was married a few times, he died young, so he never came out. So we'll assume he was straight, but he was very effeminate. So he played the sissy a lot in the 30s and 40s.
Another of Elsa Lanchester's husbands. Poor Elsa Lanchester was a beard in fiction and in real life.
And then we had Dr. Pretorius, who, I'm sorry, there is definitely a homoerotic scene with him and Dr. Frankenstein.
Totally.
And I will say the scene with the monster and the hermit. It was funny because the whole time I'm watching this and the hermit lets the monster into his home and he's becoming his friend. And I'm thinking, this is really a cozy couple. But I didn't think much of it. But that was my thought. I'm like, they make a nice, cute couple. And then I read a lot of people read gay couples into that. And I don't know if that's true, but I can definitely see where it came from. I do feel like the homoerotic between Pretorius and Frankenstein was on purpose. I think he snuck that in there. I don't think there was a message. I think because he said this movie's not going to work. He did not want to do this film, as you know.
Sure.
And he said, I'm just going to have fun with it. And it shows. And I think a lot of the stuff that people are reading as subtext messages, I think he just said, let's have fun.
I think so. Yeah, I think so. I think that's definitely part of it. I mean, and I certainly agree with you about Dr. Pretorius. I mean, I think that Ernest Thesinger does play him much campier than even Claude Rains would have. I mean, he was also a friend of James Whale's. You know, James Whale surrounded himself with friends because he's like, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this. It was actually, you know, if you look at it and you see the character, I believe there was a novelization of Frankenstein, of this story of the Bride of Frankenstein made, and Dr. Pretorius comments about the fact that he is not the type of person that procreates. So this is how he procreates. Anyway, that's not part of the film, but yes, I definitely see that. I also see, you know, his mocking of religion is that Dr. Pretorius or is that James Whale mocking religion? You know, there's a very famous, there's a famous line in The Bride of Frankenstein, which was changed because of the production code, in which Dr. Pretorius is telling Dr. Frankenstein, you know, if you're going to believe in nature or you're going to believe in your Bible stories. The line was originally fairy tales, but they had to cut it. But the way Dr. Pretorius says Bible stories, I mean, that line, the connotations of in that line are even more impactful than if he had said fairy tales.
Yes.
So there's a lot of hidden layers in this. Some of them gay subtext. Some, yes, the loneliness. Dr. Pretorius. Is there a homoerotic relationship between these two? And, you know, frankly, Elizabeth, she's in the movie for what? She's almost in it just a little bit longer than the bride is. So the females are in this movie not too much compared with the males driving the force.
Very much a male movie.
Yeah, very, very, very much a male movie. What I think is really amazing about this is, it's Boris Karloff. You know, he was a struggling actor before Frankenstein. He wasn't the first choice for Frankenstein. Bela Lugosi was, because, you know, Bela Lugosi made a huge hit in Dracula.
Yeah.
And, but Lugosi did not want to do it. He didn't want to play another monster, even though he ended up playing monsters the rest of his career. He couldn't escape it.
Yeah.
With Karloff sometimes. But what the thing I find fascinating about Boris Karloff is the monster is so touching to me.
Yes.
I mean, he's so touching when he's in that pastoral setting with that girl and she sees him and she screams and she falls in the lake. He's just trying to help her. Now, granted, he is killing people left and right. Yes, I will admit that. Some people do get killed. But then there's the other times where he's so touching. And when he meets the hermit, and the hermit is kind to him, it just breaks your heart. You're like, oh, he's finally found friend. He's finally found a friend. And it just breaks my heart with every time it looks like he's finally going to get a break. Here come the village people. Yes. Here comes another lynch mob. You know, which also reminds me of another thing that the production code was not crazy about. Was, you notice, you know, one of the times when the lynch mob is coming after the monster and they catch him and they string him up, and almost as if he's on a crucifix. Yeah. You know, there was going to be originally a scene where the monster pushed over the statue with the Christ on it, and the production code is like, that ain't going to happen. So he pushes over another statuary, but the Christ figure is still in the background.
With a bishop.
And
the statue he pushed over was a bishop.
Yeah, well, again, hitting religion right between the eyes. And what's interesting is, and I read this, is that, you know, the monster, with all these biblical and Christian allusions, Christ was crucified and then died and then was resurrected. The monster was resurrected and then crucified. So you can't escape it when it's that. I just find that fascinating, and that's very cool. And that's part of the story, though. That's part of the gods and monsters theme of Frankenstein. People playing God and creating monsters.
The first movie I said was more of a horror film, but this one was a little more horrific in some ways. One way that was the monster murdered two people for no reason, basically. He murdered Dr. Frankenstein's assistant. I want to say Igor, but it wasn't Igor. I can't remember his name. And he also murdered Dr. Frankenstein's mentor. He had a different mentor in the first movie.
It wasn't Dr. Pretorius. Yeah.
No, it wasn't Dr. Pretorius. He wasn't in the first movie. The first two people he murdered, girls' parents. But after that, it was really after the mob was chasing him. He was being threatened. He was angry.
Yeah,
he was scared.
Self-defense.
Yeah, it was all self-defense. Well, that wasn't true in the first film. So I do see it as a little bit different. He is much more sympathetic for that reason. In the first film, he only smiled with the little girl, and that was a touching scene. This movie with the hermit is much longer. He smiles a lot more. He even laughs when he's smoking the cigarette.
Oh, smoke good. How about he's a nicotine fiend with that.
Oh my
with
Lord,
that
yes.
Smoke stick. Smoke good. I think that's so funny. I immediately thought, of course, of the scene in Young Frankenstein and the strangely sexy hermit that Gene Hackman played. I don't know what it was about that, but I was like, Gene Hackman. And but it's such a beautiful, beautiful scene. And and Karloff just gives it such pathos. And Hobson, who played Elizabeth, said that he was like one of those great clowns that make you cry. And he really is. He has very limited speech. I mean, as we said, if it was up to Karloff, he wouldn't have spoken at all. He hated that. But they gave him speech. He has to somehow progress.
He didn't sing.
Next thing you know, he's going to be singing Putting on the Ritz. Yeah, exactly. But, you got to kind of see that progression happening. And still is incredibly touching. So in the end, when he basically saves Dr. Frankenstein's life and tells him, you live. And he points at Pretorius, and the monster says, you stay. We belong dead. And he pulls that lever. Whatever that lever does causes all these explosions in the castle. You're like, okay, it's a hero's death. But is he really dead? We don't know. He comes back in Son of Frankenstein. So anyway, that's all going about saying that I'm really moved by Karloff in this. And I think the audiences were too. That's why he became such a huge star.
Well, the lever made me laugh because it was like the Deus Ex Machina of killing the monster. Out of the blue, for no reason whatsoever, he says,
where was this lever?
He even knew that the lever was going to blow up the place.
Where'd it come from?
Out of the blue, he has everybody in this laboratory, and he tells the other two to leave, and then he magically knows this lever is going to blow up this castle, and he pulls the lever and everything explodes.
Everything explodes.
It was never mentioned before.
And did you notice too, if you look at it again, if you watch it again, you see, they reshot the ending so Frankenstein and Elizabeth escaped. Because originally Frankenstein was going to die in that explosion. And they reshot it so Frankenstein and Elizabeth escape. But in the shot, Frankenstein's still there. His double basically died because they didn't, someone was asleep at the switch, or they just didn't have the money to go back and reshoot that entire explosion scene. They figured nobody will notice. And probably in 1935 they didn't. It's only because we can watch it over and over and over again, and we can, listen to DVD commentaries. Well, people don't do that anymore, but you know what I'm saying? People can analyze it, and you see, oh, wait a minute. That's Colin Clive clinging onto the wall there. I thought he just ran out with his bride.
There were some other continuity errors, which was really funny to me as quickly as this movie was made after the first movie. As you said, there was that issue. Also, the father's name of either the bride or Frankenstein's father's name changes. His first name changes from the first movie to the second movie. The actress that played Elizabeth in the first movie was a blonde.
Oh, yeah.
This movie was a brunette. And granted, she was sick. They had to get a new actress, but at least get a woman with the same hair or dye it or something. I'm like, who is this? Who is she? Because I was really confused by that. And the Burgermeister, initially I thought the Burgermeister was a different actor. So I looked it up and he was the exact same actor, but he looked totally different. He had that bushy mustache that I thought it was fake, but it must have been real because he did not have it in the first film. And it kept looking like it was going to fall off his face.
Again, the brilliant Kenneth Mars created a totally different character than the Burgermeister. You can kind of see sort of maybe where he got a seed of inspiration. But yeah, the Burgermeister's a joke. He's a total joke. I love how Una O'Connor is bossing him around. I mean, this movie is just so full of funny touches and just these insane characters. And you can see he was having a really good time making this. He's like, if I'm going to make this, I'm going to have fun doing it. And
I have a quote by David Lewis, who was Whale's partner. He said, he knew it was never going to be Frankenstein. He knew it was never going to be a movie to be proud of. So he tried to do all sorts of things that would make it memorable.
He succeeded
with
that.
He did.
That he did. I mean, isn't it funny? Because it really is now considered, which I'm not sure how he would feel about that. I have a feeling reluctant pride in his accomplishments with that. He did go on after The Bride of Frankenstein. What he would like to think of as his greatest achievement would have been Showboat. the 1936 Universal production of Showboat, which is universally, no pun intended, or pun intended, acknowledged as the greatest film version of Showboat. And it is a wonderful, wonderful film. But you know what? I got to tell you, I think Gods and Monsters is any indication. And Bride of Frankenstein is really his most enduring achievement. And I think that's fabulous. Nothing wrong with that.
I think so too. A couple things I want to bring up before we go.
Uh-huh.
One, I want to talk about Pretorius as a character who was again, this is where even though the film was fun and campy, it was darker in the sense that Dr. Frankenstein was a man of science. He went mad in his desire to do this experiment, but he wasn't necessarily a bad man. He never killed anyone for his experiments. And he was, like I said, a man of science. Right. Dr. Pretorius was dark. He was evil.
Yeah.
He was evil. In fact, one of his great lines is, "Sometimes I have wondered whether life would be much more amusing if we were all devils. No nonsense about angels and being good."
Oh. He is dark.
Yes.
He is dark.
And, Dr. Frankenstein had his assistant, who sadly was murdered, though he did come back as a different person in this film.
Yeah, he did.
Pretorius had 2 killers. He knew they were murderers that were escaped, that worked for him. In addition, Dr. Frankenstein dug up bodies and he found a brain in a laboratory. Dr. Pretorius had them murder people for his experiments.
Yeah, yeah.
So he was a much darker character.
Well, how about his little people he has in the jars?
Well, and I was going to bring that up. Yeah, the people that he has living in those jars.
That he created, that he grew organically. That's his whole point, is that, Frankenstein went and resurrected dead people. I've created them from cultures. I've grown these people. That scene really creeps me out. It really creeped me out. I'm astounded by the special effects. It was done, done by the incredible John Fulton and David S. Horsley. And they did it by shooting for 2 days, actors in full-size jars, and then against black velvet. And he aligned them up with the perspective of the onset jars, of the smaller jars, and they were able to mat that on there. And it's an incredible effect. But what an evil little guy.
Yes.
What a creepy little guy is he. I mean, that's just, those people in those jars creeped me out. And you'd only see it from the back, but one of those people was a baby.
Oh.
Did you know that?
No.
You can see it from the back. It was played by Billy Barty. Billy
really?
Barty's pretty well-known little person. Did a lot of movies, and they thought they couldn't do that. It was not right. So they did, but there is one scene when it's shot from the back, when Frankenstein comes over to him, that you can see the back of the baby in the high chair. That's a creepy scene.
I was equally impressed by these miniature people. First of all, I think creating these miniature people out of the blue is much more amazing than bringing a dead person back to life. I mean, they're both pretty astounding, but
yeah,
they were living, breathing, thinking individuals. They just happened to be very tiny. I gotta say, the special effects. So, King Kong is continuously rated. The original King Kong is continuously rated the greatest special effects movie of all time. Now, people will watch it and see the stop motion, and they think, "What the hell are you talking about?" But they say for that time period, that was such a big step from what they had before. Now, I think some people would argue it, but that is what I hear constantly. I will say there's 2 other movies that impress me more. One is the movie San Francisco. The earthquake scenes in San Francisco are astonishing. The other is this film. Those many people, those special effects were better than the little effects they always did on I Dream of Jeannie and Bewitched.
Yes.
Far better.
Yes.
I just sat there and I just was astonished.
Well, they did it through rotoscoping. Rotoscoping is an animation technique that basically you use to trace over motion picture footage. So, and it's frame by frame. So can you imagine how time consuming it was to do that scene? I mean, this is how they did things back then, though. They didn't have, there was no CGI, big surprise. Things did in the camera, or they were done optically in the lab afterwards. So it's really amazing when he picks up the king by the tweezers and drops him in the jar. I'm like, that's phenomenal. That was done frame by frame. You say what you want to about these films. The skill that was put into these movies is astounding. It's astounding that they did it. They didn't need CGI. They didn't need computers. They just needed a lot of animation and techniques, and they were able to achieve it. And to me, that's the freakiest scene in the whole movie.
Well, and yeah, you brought up the thing that astonished me the most, because I'm sitting there looking at these little people in the jars, and they're banging on the glass at each other and that sort of thing. And I'm like, wow. And then when he picked up the king and
Crazy.
dropped him, I'm like, holy shit.
Yeah, I know. It was amazing.
Like, how the fuck did they do that?
Yes. Well, in Hollywood, there was a whole world of gods and monsters. So, to quote our friend Dr. Pretorius, here's to a world of gods and monsters. I don't do it like him at all. I'll go back to...
Perfect. You sound just like Karloff. I thought he was right here in the room. I am just so glad we watched this film. I was like, like I said, when it started, I wanted to see it because it'd been, I was a little kid when I last saw this. I didn't remember anything at all. Other than, the clips I've seen where I thought, God, that's really campy. And I just had so much fun with this, which I didn't expect. And it probably wouldn't have been as fun if I had expected it to be that fun.
Yeah, and it was really nice that it was a suggestion. So thank you so much, Susan, for suggesting this. We really appreciate that. We appreciate what you said about the podcast, too. But we really appreciate the suggestion. It's fun. It's a great way to kick off our Halloween movies. We got some fun ones coming up. Scary, yes, and maybe one that's not so scary, but kind of funny, too. We'll see. So
please reach out. You can do a text that's in the show notes. You can send us a text. We can't respond, but we'll read it on the air. Or you can go to the website at goingtohollywoodpodcast.com. There's a contact page. We would really love it if you did a recording. That would be a lot of fun to play your recording. Please do that.
That's fun. That would be fun. Yeah, and we also have our Spotify playlist, which where we put movies. We put songs on here that I can't sing.
We have a really good list of songs on there. This movie, I think the one Oscar it won was the film score, wasn't it?
Yes, Franz Waxman score. Beautiful. Iconic score.
Yeah, so we'll find something to put in there from this film.
Oh, we will, absolutely. Yeah. We'll drop something in there. Well, this has been so much fun. I don't think I want to say goodbye, Brad. So let's not say goodbye. Let's just say au revoir.
No, Tony, let's say goodbye. That's his way of saying goodbye, everybody.